Welcome to Collision, the podcast where we discuss the fun and sometimes complicated collision of real life and trusting God. If you're curious or confused about how to engage the world we live in, we hope our conversation here helps. Now, let's get into this episode of Collision.
Welcome to the Collision Podcast. My name is Matt Manning, and I am here with James. James, Impossible 7 is out in the theaters. My question to you is, what kind of face cream do you think Tom Cruise uses to stay looking so young?
Ooh, that's a good one, huh? I would guess it's something that the lovely Katie Holmes gave him years ago. How's that?
Very nice, very nice. It appears that you're using the same cream, so maybe you could let us know at a later podcast.
There you go. Oh yeah, get the glow happening.
That's it. Well, today, James and I are talking about spiritual warfare, what that looks like in the Christian life, and how we go about handling that. And as we get started really today and jump into this, we thought we'd just maybe start with The Exorcist, that movie from a long time ago. Do you remember the first time you saw it?
Oh yeah, man, it was like this a taboo movie that my older brother told me about, and it was just like, yeah, like I think it was late at night on HBO, and man, like I only got a little bit into it. Like as soon as I saw the priest, I was like freaked out. And
I'm
he
out.
wasn't even
I'm
the
out.
bad guy. Yeah.
That's funny. How old were you?
Oh, probably maybe 8 or 10.
Yeah, 8 or 10.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, I was in high school when I first saw The Exorcist, and, it was freaky. I don't ever want to watch it again. I went through this whole season of my life where I watched like horror movies and all that kind of stuff, and I determined that some of that stuff is just, I don't know, I don't need to see it ever again. But kind of funny story,
Yeah.
our former senior pastor, his name is Kim. And, he shared a story of when he first watched The Exorcist. It was actually because his mom made him. So his mom took him and his siblings and sat him down in front of a TV and said, "You need to know about this stuff. Play." And that's how he watched The Exorcist.
And if anybody knows her, she is the sweetest, most gentle Christian woman that yeah. Well,
Yeah,
isn't it comforting to know that wonderful, gentle people, unlike us, can make really bad decisions too?
that's true. That's true. Oh man. So as we jump into really this conversation, when we talk about spiritual warfare, all of our minds goes to The Exorcist and the movie, and even the new one, I think with Russell Crowe, right, where he's hunting demons under the Vatican or whatever that was about. And but the reality is that when we open up the scriptures, it does talk about spiritual warfare. And so as we jump into this, I just kind of want to know your beginning thoughts as we start to unpack this.
Yeah, man. So the biggest thing for me is the contrast of how I think Christians are encouraged to think and kind of how our culture thinks, right?
Yeah.
Like most of my friends who are not people of Christian faith, a lot of them are still spiritual in a sense, but for like a lot of the conversations are think good thoughts or throw some positive energy in my direction. And it's almost this idea that if there is a spiritual realm, that it's only good, right? Like it's
Right.
only like unicorns and glitter,
Yeah,
you know?
exactly.
And that we're actually given a different picture from the Bible that is in contrast. I mean, it's an inconvenient truth in some ways, but it's in contrast to, I think, our cultural narrative of a spiritual world, if there is one.
Yeah. I actually think the narrative that you're speaking to actually kind of pervades Western Christianity, right? I think a lot of Christians, when we actually dive into what the scriptures have to say about spiritual warfare and what's happening in the realm beyond us, there is this real sense in the scriptures that we're at war, that we are in wartime. And I think for a lot of Western Christians, there's this kind of peacetime casualness to the way that we live our lives. For most of us, we go about our day, and there's no quote unquote, like bombs falling near us, right? There's no bullets whizzing past our head. There's no mines to be avoided. There's no roars on the horizon. Like we live our lives as if like everything is well in America. And yet the reality is when we open up the scriptures, like that is as far from the truth that we see when we read like the spiritual realm is real, that there's this war going on between good and evil. And most of us kind of just blissfully live like we're on the vacation on the beach somewhere.
Yeah. Well, and the other big danger that I see, and as much in our modern day as in the past, is that if people think there's a battle, they see the battle against conservatives and liberals, or Democrats and Republicans, or whatever position you are, that there's a physical enemy that you're actually against. And again, the Bible actually doesn't teach that. Matter of fact, a biblical view is actually the people who are so strongly fighting against the values of God are actually in a form of bondage, right? And
Yeah.
blindness. Like they're fighting a battle that they don't even realize that they're doing. I mean, it's kind of like I do remember the Matrix, right? And
Yeah.
and the agents in the Matrix, and how they would fill the bodies of various people and use them, whether it's a security guard or somebody else, until that person got shot, and then they would just exit the body and the body would flop to the floor. But
Yeah.
that poor guy with his family, like he was a pawn in a bigger game.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah, I would say like when we open up the scriptures and look into it, like one of the most fascinating scriptures, at least to me in all of the Bible, is in the Old Testament. And we find it in the book of Daniel. And kind of just the setup is, you have this whole book of the Bible that's dedicated to this one guy named Daniel. And kind of his backstory is that in 605 BC, right, Babylon, the big bad empire, comes in Judah. They're like, we're going to crush you. And then they do. Right, they crush Judah, and what they do is they take out all of kind of the smart ones, right, the men and women who were well endowed, who had the features, and they bring them all the way back to Babylon, and they basically make them these like elevated slaves in in Babylon. And so Daniel's like this faithful dude to God, and every day he gets down on his knees and he's praying like, God, don't forget your people. Don't forget where we're at. Don't lose sight of us. And so every day he's praying on his behalf of the people. Every day he gets down on his knees. He's doing this, and then one day this angel actually shows up. And what the angel says is crazy. It goes like this. It says, "Then he said to me, 'Fear not, Daniel. For from the first day that you set your heart to understand and humbled yourself before your God, your words have been heard. And I have come because of your words. The prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me 21 days, but Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me, for I was left there with the king of Persia.'" Now, like, this is like a total crazy story, because we know that the king of Persia in this is not like some like literal king, walking in Persia, but rather that this is like pointing us towards and pulling back the curtain for a moment on like the spiritual realm. And the king of Persia is this demon, right? That's this territorial demon that's in charge. And Daniel's praying, and the story is God looks at an angel and says, "Hey, I need you to go minister to Daniel. I need you to let him know that he's not forgotten." And as this angel's on the way to Daniel, these demons stop him. They throw him in jail. And this angel's like, it got so bad that Michael, who's the big bad boss of all the angels, right, had to come in, throw some elbows and throw punches, break me out of prison so that I could get to you on this day so that I could minister to you. And it's
Yeah.
like, what?
Right. Yeah.
you know? And I think the story points out, the spiritual dimension, particularly that when we enter into the practice of prayer, that we are mobilizing an assault, right, on the heavenlies or in the heavenlies. And we don't think of it that way. We think we're just offering up a prayer to God. But there's a whole world that oftentimes we walk in this life totally unaware of, the things that are happening in the spiritual realm that are impacting us every single day. And even as crazy as that story is in the Old Testament, we have passages of scripture like this in the New Testament. In fact, just recently you preached on one of those in Ephesians chapter 6.
Yeah. So the passage that we looked at was all about us putting on the armor of God. These like a faith and truth and righteousness. These things that tend to live in more theoretical landscape for a lot of Christians. Like, sure, I believe in truth, but the way the author of Ephesians talks about it is like these are actually like offensive weapons. Like when you're attacked, grab truth and use that against your enemy. When you're attacked this way, grab faith, believing things that are unseen as if they are finished and complete. And so he takes these lofty theoretical words that we use, and he makes them incredibly practical and encourage us through prayer and our posture in situations to actually seek victory through submitting ourselves to God and his provision in the midst of it. And it's just such an interesting landscape, because I think, and even as pastors, I mean, like, I've been guilty over the years of, you come home and your son, not your son, but my son says something to my wife and she's mad and she's not talking, and there's like discord in my house. And my first thing is like, where's the boy? Right. And maybe that's part of it, but how often do I blow right past the possibility that the enemy is seeking to sow discord in my household, and for the peace of Jesus to leave, and I just go in, yelling and kicking and threatening, and the enemy's like, this is fantastic, that's exactly what I wanted you to do, right?
Right. And I think what's so fascinating about the passage is that Paul actually tells us who our enemies are, right? He says, look, your enemies are not flesh and blood, right? Your enemy is not the boy that you're looking for. Your enemy is not the person that stands politically on the other side of the aisle. Your enemy isn't the guy who cut you off on I-25. That you have enemies that are in the spiritual world, right? The princes and the principalities, of the spiritual world. It's speaking of the demons in that. It's speaking of the devil, is where Paul is leading us. And I think as Christians, we so oftentimes get that confused when it comes to spiritual warfare, right? That we think that God's given us these weapons and tells us to mount up so that we can go fight, whoever's standing across us from across the aisle from us, whether that be the liberals, the conservatives, whatever side you're on. And it's like, man, when you're attacking flesh and blood, you're actually shooting the captives.
Yeah. Absolutely.
You're not, and we're called to bring freedom and liberation. That's what we are as Christians. And that the fight is not here in this world. The fight is in the spiritual realm, every single day of our lives. Like you said, sowing discord, right? Distracting us from what we need to do or where we need to be, confusing us in such a way that our fight, we think, is against other people rather than, the evil and the darkness that pervades this world.
Well, I think for a lot of people, they like we can fall into the camp of assuming that there's no spiritual realm or there's no danger there. And then there's the people that like read a lot of the wrong books, and there's a demon behind everything, right?
Yeah.
And I think where God calls us to live, according to Ephesians and the bulk of Scripture, is to live humbly under His authority and submit all things to Him, right? So the ability to like pray into some depression that you or a loved one is going through, like, God, is there any aspect of this that's spiritual that you want to deal with, or because a pill might not fix this, right? Or, but man, how quickly we as the church just blow right past that possibility and move into like secular scientific solutions, which there's some great resources out there, but we completely blow past submitting to the wisdom of God and just asking Him. I mean, I think of that a great story where Jesus sent His disciples out 2 by 2, and they came back and they had mixed reports. Some of them were like, it was awesome, and other guys were like, yeah, we came up with this guy and we the demon wouldn't come out of him. And Jesus is like,
Right.
oh yeah, that one only comes out through prayer and fasting.
Right.
Right?
Good notes to give us beforehand, Jesus.
Yeah. A week ago, that would have been really, but what did it do to their heart? Because the very next thing they asked is, Lord, teach us how to pray. And
Yeah.
it's like, man, that is so important for us to want to learn how to battle in God's strength,
Mm.
and not just in our own power.
Yeah.
And for men, that's physical a lot of times. I think for like my wife, it's relational,
Yeah.
which is good. Those are good qualities, but sometimes God wants us to learn to engage the spiritual.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what you're saying is so important. The way that I've heard it said before is that, as Americans, we pretend the spiritual world doesn't exist. And if you go to Africa, everything's, spiritual.
Yeah.
And so I think what you said was just so good. Like, would you mind just like articulating that one more time? So like as our life, we call this podcast collision, right? So as our life collides with the spiritual realm, how would you advise someone who goes, "Man, is this spiritual or is it not?" How would you walk them down that path?
Yeah. I mean, really, man, this is kind of on the spot. You didn't prep me for this one. Um, I think I think really it begins with kind of stepping back and taking almost like a spiritual audit of the situation.
Mm,
Like we use this tool as a staff called the Peace Index,
yeah,
where you look at these various aspects of your life, and you just like think about like how my vocation, how is my health, how is finance and provision, and that helps you usually kind of identify like if I'm grumpy or if I'm bummed out. It's like I can usually identify where the tension point is,
yeah,
and then for me, it would begin with simply bringing that to a God, and saying, God, I want you to diagnose this rightly. Is there any spiritual aspect
mm,
of this um, that you want me to be aware of? And a lot of times in my situation, I mean, if there's something going on with one of my kids or my wife, a lot of times as I pray for them, I'll just pray, God, I don't know if this is spiritual or not, but I just want to say in the name of Jesus, I just pray against
mm.
any influence that the enemy might be having in the situation. And if Jesus is like, yeah, it's not spiritual, he just needs some medicine, right? It's like that's
Right.
cool, right?
Yeah, yeah.
But but I don't want to go to the medicine before I go to the healer first and
Mhm.
ask him, because yeah,
Yeah, no, that's so good. I think you're right on. I think it's that idea of we submit all things to the Lord, you know, and uh and realizing that his answer, you know, um can be both spiritual and physical and sometimes at the same time, right? Like we've all read stories where, mom thinks that, child is sick and it's spiritual and prays and prays the kid into the grave, right? Because they never
yeah,
went and got the physical healing that they needed through the miracle of medicine. And then other times, we walk through life and it's like, man, there is clearly something spiritual going on in your life. At Crossroads, we used to talk about, and we still do, I shouldn't say used to, talk about strongholds. It's those places that we give a foothold to evil in our lives. And so it's like, man, you open up the computer as a guy and you dip into pornography day after day after day. What you are doing is you are giving, right, the evil powers of this world a foothold into your life. What happens from that? Someone in my family went through a season of drugs, and they would take these drugs that would, open their minds. And as their mind was opened, they would see, the spiritual realm is the way that they would describe that. And through these psychedelic drugs, all of this would happen to them to the point where it was like, you know what, these drugs are actually creating something within me, not just physical,
yeah.
but spiritual. And, as we had the conversation, it's like, man, you keep going to that, you're just opening a foothold for the evils of this world. And so I think that, submitting all things to God and going, God, like I need you to look at this. And I pray if this is spiritual, push it out. And if this
Yeah.
is physical, man, help me get the help that I need. If it's mental, lead me to the places that I can get that kind of help. One other story years ago, uh, there was this young boy who came and visited me, and really struggling with demonic activity in his life. And I'd meet with him and I'd try to figure out what's going on, and we'd pray and going through all of this. And then I found out that his favorite author was Frank Peretti, who wrote all about like demons
Yeah.
and the spiritual world and all this kind of stuff. And I was like, man, you got to stop reading that stuff, because it's hard to know, like, is this boy's imagination that's running wild? As he reads these books, is it actually opening him up to something that he's not actually ready to understand yet? And creating kind of that foothold. But I didn't know which one it was, but I knew what the solution was. Stop reading the books.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
And
I'll read some John Wick. Be better for you.
I thought you were going to go to Gospel of John.
Well, and it's personal, and it's also like in the scope of the church and our culture, right? I mean, like I think of it in our day, with a political discord that we have, with a tension between races, with gender and sexual confusion, with mass issues with depression. I'm not saying it's all spiritual, but I can't negate the possibility or probability that there's something spiritual about this, right? That one
Absolutely.
in four kids is confused about their gender. I don't know. I mean, is it possible that that's a spiritual power that's working through our culture to cause discord and to do what Jesus said? He wants to steal, kill, and destroy.
Yeah. And even if we can't figure out whether it's spiritual warfare or not, do we not want to enter into the spiritual realm and call upon the God of all hope, right, to bring healing and peace into the situation? Because at the end of the day, one of the things that I always go back to is that life is war, right? The enemy's awesome, and you don't stand a chance unless you're connected with God, right?
Yeah.
Like, life is war, the enemy is awesome, and you don't stand a chance unless you're connected to God. And so everything that we bring and take into our life really is to bring us to a place where we are submitting to Jesus and going, I'm not sure if I know what this is. I know the spiritual world is real. I know angels get held up for 21 days when I'm praying. you know,
Yeah. Yeah.
God, I need you to intervene.
Yeah. And the wisdom and the love of God in that. I mean, I think of that amazing scene in Saving Private Ryan in the landing craft before the gate goes down, and Tom Hanks is like, "Get off the beach as quick as you can,
Yeah.
and I'll see you on the other side." And those are loving instructions, right? I mean, he like a beach is a kill zone, and he's warning the guys like, nobody's hopping off the landing craft with a Yeti cooler, right?
Right.
like
Yeah.
like
Absolutely.
it's not that kind of beach trip. Like they're getting off the beach as fast as they can for the rendezvous point, to where Tom Hanks' character can refocus them on the next thing. And I mean, that's such a picture of how God wants to relate with us. And in the spiritual realm, he's saying it's real. Don't fear it, but wage those battles with my power.
Yeah. And I think, the disciples were right, when they came up against the spiritual world that they were not able to overcome, their immediate response was to look at Jesus and go, Jesus, would you teach us how to pray? Like, would you teach us
Yeah.
to see what this actually looks like? And I think for that's a big question that we can dive into. And I think for our next podcast, that would be a good place for us to go, is to look at prayer and go, this was the solution or this was the tool, this was the weapon
Yeah.
that the disciples sought when the spiritual world was overwhelming, when this world was overwhelming. And
Yeah.
and so next time when we get together, let's just have that conversation about what does it look like to actually pray? What is prayer? And we can just walk through that and look at that together. As we wrap up this conversation, I just want to say that your sermon is a great sermon that people can check out. They can go to crossroadsabc.com, check out the archives there. As we wrap up today, is there anything that you'd like to add to this?
Yeah, I mean, just my strong encouragement to everybody is that, man, like this in our science driven culture, like the reality of a spiritual realm is so underplayed by the culture that I can't hesitate to believe that our enemy wants us to lean into science exclusively, because we're easy to pick off if we don't see his plan at play. So I mean, our goal in none of this is to scare people or to freak them out. But as a culture, as a movement, we want to help people navigate this. So come to Crossroads, walk life with us, and let's unpack this together in relationship and with the God that wants to lead us toward good things on the other side.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's one of the big questions that we oftentimes get is, what does spiritual warfare look like? How do I know it? I mean, these are questions that we as pastors get asked all the time, which is why this is such a relevant conversation in it. I think the thing that reminds me as we wrap this up is that oftentimes when I look at this world, and that helps to remind me, going back to our enemies are not flesh and blood, is that when I look at someone and what they're doing is sinful or harmful or broken, whatever word you want to use, if in that moment I find anger and judgment welling up in my heart and a readiness to fight against them, then, from the scriptures, that was the Pharisee mindset. You
Mhm.
know, that's what Jesus was against. And the way of Jesus is that when I look at that person, if my heart is welled up with despair and it's sorrow, right? And all of a sudden I'm heartbroken towards that person because of the sin that they're in and the spiritual fight that's being waged with them at the center. If I'm led to heartbreak, then I look a lot like Jesus. And I think that as we enter into the spiritual war, as we talk about the spiritual world, we want to look like Jesus at the end of the day. And so that's always our encouragement at Crossroads, and is to look and walk like Jesus, man. We want to be as much like Jesus as we possibly can, so that when the world looks at us, they see him. And
Love it.
well, with that said, thanks for joining me today. It's been a fun talk.
Yeah, buddy. Thanks,
All
man.
right. We'll have to learn all about prayer before our next time.
Exactly.
All right. So long. We'll see you all later.
Thank you for listening to Collision. This podcast is a production of Crossroads Church in Thornton, Colorado. For more excellent content, please visit crossroadsabc.com.